Thank you. So let me tell you a little bit about the topics I'd like to cover tonight and warn you that I have mostly questions and very few answers, okay? But the questions I'm going to be sharing with you are questions that are shaping the debate in the United States about the future impact of AI in society, and are questions that, because we don't have very good answers to them, are leading us to build a new research agenda with the support of the National Science Foundation of the United States, which I will be sharing with you tonight, to try to gain a better understanding of these questions. How to think about the possible effects of AI on work. There's a lot of concern, a lot of fears, a lot of optimism that AI is going to change everything. There's a lot of talk, but actually very little clear thinking. And many of us in the United States think that we actually don't have a good scientific framework to think through what are going to be the effects of AI in society. Because this is not the first time that the United States or many other societies have experienced technological change. What is different this time? Again, a lot of the talk in the United States is that AI is very different as a technology, is going to have very different impacts. But again, it's important maybe to stop and consider exactly why do we think that AI will be different. And a question which comes at the interplay of what many of us think are the two most important phenomena going on in the world now. One of them obviously is technological developments in AI, which I guess is why many of you are here tonight. But the other one is the urbanization process that's going on all over the planet. So that by the middle of this century, most human beings will live in cities. And in fact, by the middle of this century, most human beings will either be living in Chinese or cities in India. So what's the interplay of these two phenomena? Developments in AI and urbanization. I should clarify, there's one thing I'm not going to talk about, which is smart cities. Because I'm not an expert in smart cities. There are many experts on smart cities. So I will hardly say nothing about this. But these are sort of the general questions that I'll be raising. And again, almost everything that I'm going to talk about is about the context I'm familiar with, which is the United States. I'll be curious, hopefully in our conversation, to find out whether the concerns and the worries and even fears that are very prevalent now in discussions about AI in the United States, are they relevant or not to China? But the major concern in the United States about AI, there are a lot of people, of course, who are very optimistic about AI, but there are many, many people and many policymakers who are worried about the effects of AI on labor. Specifically, will AI replace a lot of human labor? Will it lead to what is known in the United States as technological unemployment? Okay? So there's this view, and there have been lots of news and lots of reports, okay? So a robot telling a factory worker, go, you no longer have a job, okay? There will be humans in unemployment lines because robots have taken their jobs. And there have been a lot of these so-called reports. So, you know, this is a very famous one. A few years ago, a group of researchers at Oxford University came out with a prediction, well, a study that in the United Kingdom, 47% of all jobs were going to be replaced by AI. I mean, which sounds quite dramatic, correct? I mean, if you, or a consulting company, McKinsey, came out with this report that in the United States by 2030, which is not that far away, 73 million jobs will be lost. So this is concern, a lot of these studies. This has created this dynamic, this tension in the United States, which I don't think is a very useful one, between those who are very pessimistic about AI, a lot of citizens, a lot of policymakers, who believe that machines will replace workers, okay? Almost like a science fiction scenario. And then there is this view, this optimism, that admittedly you find mostly in Silicon Valley, that AI will solve everything. Whatever problem you think we humans have, AI will solve it. And in between these two extremes are dominating discussion, okay? And it might not surprise you, by now you probably can deduce that I think neither one of these views is very grounded in science. And there is a concern among the research community in the United States that the debate on the impact of AI in society, and specifically labor, workers, is full of opinions. I mean, these studies, I'm not suggesting that these studies are useless, but they're almost useless. Because when you actually read this, and you say, where is the data? Can I access this data? So if what's the number one criteria, correct? If you ever read a study, this is what we tell our students. If you read any study, what's the first criteria? What's the first characteristic that any study must have? What do we tell our students? Someone else, so if this report comes out in the United Kingdom, someone in Mongolia should be able to read the report, access the data, and see whether he or she can reproduce it. Without talking to anyone, just give me the data, tell me what you did, and see if I can do it. Most of these studies, they use private data that's a little bit kind of strange. Where does it come from? I cannot give it to you. Oh, I use data that a friend of mine at Tencent gave it to me. I cannot give it to you. So these studies are not scientific studies. So that led this concern that there's a lot of public discussion about a very important topic for which at the moment we don't have a lot of good understanding, led the National Science Foundation of the United States, which you probably all know is one of the principal sources of funding for scientific research. It led the National Science Foundation to convene a conference, which I was asked to organize, and it was held in December 2017. This conference was held at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and this was a conference that brought together lots and lots of experts on AI from academia and the private sector. In retrospect, I wish we had invited someone from Tencent, but we cannot use National Science Foundation to pay for overseas trips, so maybe. But it had a lot of people, Google, Microsoft, and we came together to first consider why don't we have a better understanding of this question, and what needs to happen for there to be a research agenda on the impact of AI in society that's more than just this type of studies, okay? So it's not often, by the way, the National Science Foundation of the United States does not often fund this type of effort. It funds mostly work. You want money to do something, they give it to you. But here, the NSF thought it was important for there to be a public discussion of an agenda on AI and its impact. And out of this question, out of this conference, came this paper published in PNAS, which is the journal of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States, where we, myself, my colleagues, try to tell the research community in the United States what sort of research do we need to begin to understand better that question. So I'd like to give you a little bit of a sense of what are the challenges, what are the impediments, as we now see them, towards getting a good understanding of the impact of artificial intelligence, describe a little bit of that agenda, and then how that agenda connects with other research agendas in the United States. And again, let me emphasize, if you have any question at any point or comment, please don't wait till the end, okay? So, first, how are we going to think about, so this sounds very easy. We all agree, correct? Probably everybody here in this room agrees that AI will have an impact. Is there anybody here who doesn't? Is there anybody here who thinks AI will have no impact? Okay, that's the easy part. But now, let's start to think about how are we going to think through? Like with any scientific question, how do we think about it? How do we think about the effects of AI on society? How are we going to think about it? How are we going to measure it? What data do we need so we can answer this question? So we need to have a perspective as a research community to think about the effects of AI, okay? And the first thing to realize is AI might be very different, but AI represents something that we have seen before, technological change. And there have been many, 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 many episodes throughout human history where technological change had profound, profound impacts. So if AI is going to change everything, it's not the first time that technological change will change everything. In fact, if you ask many historians of technology about what is the most important technological change that has ever occurred, that had tremendous, tremendous impact, it dwarfs the possible effects of AI. And what is that, by the way? So think back. What is probably the most dramatic technological change human beings have ever had? And it's not the air conditioning. I mean, being here in Beijing makes me think that air conditioning is a very important invention. Actually, this is not a joke. Deborah and I live in a city in the United States, Phoenix, that if it weren't for air conditioning, we couldn't live in Phoenix. Because between April and October, temperatures in Phoenix are about 42, 43, 44 degrees. So air conditioning is very important. And even a truly dramatic invention that did change everything. What is it? The agricultural revolution. When we mastered agriculture, it completely transformed everything. That was truly a tremendous technological revolution, correct? Think about it. So, and there'll be many others, electricity, steel. So we meaning scientists, we have been studying technological change for many decades now. We have learned something about technological change and how it affects society. So we ought to be maybe draw on previous studies of technological change to help us think through about AI. So the first point is dramatic technological change has happened before. It might be that AI ends up being even more dramatic than anything before, but just the fact that AI is dramatic does not make it different. And almost when historians and engineers and economists, many researchers, anthropologists study technological change, we think that there are two basic distinctions. One that is fundamental for any new technology that's introduced. And of course, before the agricultural revolution, of course, there was another very important technological change, the use of stones, okay? And it's very interesting that scientists have been studying a lot. What did we human beings do with the very first stone tools? That's another very important. And by now we have a very important insight on what was the most dramatic effect of stone tools. You know what it is? You know what was the biggest effect of stone tools? Yes, killing other people. It was not killing animals. It was not used to hunt animals. It's very, very inefficient to hunt an animal with a stone. But if you don't like your neighbor at night, it's very efficient. And so we know that the consequence of the first fundamental technological revolution, the use of stones, was to increase the rate of murders. AI? Will people use AI to kill their neighbors who make a lot of noise at night? I don't know. Well, so there's this distinction, which is, we argue in this paper, is very important. For any technological change, does it augment labor? Does it allow you to do something you already did better or faster, but you still have to do it? We call that labor augmenting. Or technology can be indeed labor replacing. Technology might allow me to achieve a goal for which I no longer need you. And we argue that this is a fundamental feature of any technological change. The challenge is to think through, well, what will AI do? This or that? Or perhaps more complicatedly, what if it does the two things? Okay? Then, when you think about what will AI actually affect, just what is it? What is it? We argue that AI effect will be on occupations. And we see occupations as a collection of skills. And these skills allows for a task to be performed. So this is a lot of terms. Let me just make sure we understand. Exactly, none of them are very complicated, but so when I think about, and the question we're asking here is, there's an analogy to physics, okay? So when I think about what does the applying a force, how does it have an effect? We talk about, well, I'm going to apply a force on this. This is what I'm applying a force to. So we're asking, what is it that AI will actually affect? And we think that AI, because it is a new technology, is going to affect tasks. How do you perform a task? We all perform tasks. That's the basic fundamental process of any economy. Tasks need to be performed. I need to grow food. I need to move. I need to move a chair from here to here. I have a problem and it needs to be solved. Those are tasks. We currently, usually tasks are solved by skills. Okay? You wake up one morning and you see that there's water dripping out of your bathtub. That's a problem. It requires a solution. Who do you call? Do you call José, a professor? Do you call a ballerina? Or do you call a plumber? I mean, it's kind of obvious, correct? Well, the assumption is, here's a problem. Someone out there has the skills to solve that problem. And it's not just enough to be smart. I am somewhat smart. And I don't know how to, well, actually, I don't know how to do almost anything that's practical. Okay, so there are tasks to be done. Skills are matched to those tasks. And when you put a lot of skills together, you have an occupation, which is a technical term that economists use. Okay? So my occupation is a professor. Okay? So if I tell you I'm a professor and I teach math, you can probably make a lot of predictions about what I know what to do. Okay? So we're arguing to understand the effects of AI in society, we need to think about the effects of AI on skills and on tasks. Okay? So for us, the task is the central fact of any act of production. Tasks need to be performed. And at any one time, by now, most tasks that we humans perform are done through a combination of our own labor and equipment and machine and infrastructure, electricity, water, okay? So skills have to be combined with machinery, equipment, and we perform a task, okay? So to think through the effects of AI in society, we argue what we really need to do is to think, what are the type of tasks which AI will be able to perform quicker, faster, more efficiently? And those you can pretty much predict, those tasks will be done by AI, done by machines, but then you have to think through what are the tasks for which at the moment it's hard for us to imagine that AI can perform. But again, this has happened with any other previous technological revolution. You know, the most recent big technological revolution we've lived through, well, I guess none of us were alive in 1850, but the Industrial Revolution, where many tasks, very complicated tasks, spinning, making clothes, there were many tasks that were replaced by machines which were powered by coal and then by gasoline, okay? So we've seen this before. But what's important to remember when we think about the Industrial Revolution, which in effect is often used as a point of reference to think about the effects of AI, because, well, it happened more recently than the Agricultural Revolution. We do have a lot of data about what happened during the Agricultural Revolution, okay? And we do know that although loss of jobs were eliminated because machines replaced humans during the Industrial Revolution, textile factories replaced thousands, if not millions of workers, because you could now produce textiles in an automated fashion. But at the same time, we know, we have the data, it has been studied, that the very same Industrial Revolution that eliminated whole classes of jobs, people who made textiles. Think of all, at least in the United States, but I'm sure in China, in the United States in the 19th century, in 1840, there were hundreds, historians have actually counted them, there were hundreds of jobs that had to do with keeping horses happy. You know, I mean, you have a horse, yeah. Wow, you know, I am not a horse expert, actually Deborah is, but, you know, a horse, you have to feed a horse, you have to, this thing in the, yep, you have to, the horse has to sleep somewhere. If the horse has a stomach ache, someone has to do something. Yes, there were hundreds of jobs which were completely eliminated when the automobile replaced the horse. And of course, we know when agriculture in the United States was mechanized. By the way, so next time you are at a party and someone asks you, what is by far the most productive sector of the US economy? What would you answer? By far. I mean, by far. Agriculture, yes. Not Silicon Valley, agriculture. The number of people involved in growing food in the United States now is less than 1 million. And less than 1 million people can feed most of the world. Because agriculture was tremendously affected by the agricultural revolution. So millions of people were displaced from the countryside. So what happened? Why was there not a tremendous revolution in the United States in the late 19th century? Because other jobs, other sectors were created as a result of the use of machinery that not only absorbed labor that was displaced, it created new jobs. So you no longer needed to have these stations with grass to feed horses. You needed gas stations and car repair shops. So we know that it is possible for a technology to be introduced that's very new and In the 19th century, the steam engine was as radical, some argue, as AI is today. And then gasoline engine was even more radical, okay? Don't forget that the energy intensity of gasoline is 33 times that of gas. I mean, it was just a tremendous revolution. Lots of jobs were lost, new ones were created. And in balance, more people were employed than displaced. So, we argue in this paper, this experience forces us, makes it possible for us to think. The specific question is, AI will displace jobs, but can AI create new jobs? And the answer is, it has happened before. And in science, what is the absolutely best, the only way we can answer a question about the future in the science, okay? Let's say if the future, you want to know something about the future. And when you think about the various techniques that we have in the sciences to predict the future, almost all of them have one fundamental condition that's often not that clear to people. We are very good at predicting the future when? When? When the future is mostly like the past. And we know how to do that. And we have statistics. We actually don't know how to predict the future when the future is completely unlike the past. That's kind of a secret we don't tell our students. We actually don't know how to predict the future. Okay? That's why you give me a task. What is my task? I have to build a wall to protect a city, New Orleans, from hurricanes. Oh, I can do it. As long as hurricanes in the future will be like hurricanes in the past. If one day there's a hurricane whose power is unlike any hurricane seen before, the wall I just built you is not going to work. It's not because I'm an idiot or because I'm dishonest. It's because I thought the future would be like the past. So in this case, we have reason to believe maybe AI will not make everybody unemployed, but we have to think about the ways in which it is similar to the past, okay? And so we have this notion, historical notion of automation. Automation is simply when a current set of tasks can be completely performed by machines and algorithms without direct human involvement. We call that automation. It happened in the past. The claim that AI will lead to automation is not what makes AI different, because we've seen this before. The argument then is therefore that the scale of automation, the scope of automation, is going to be vastly larger than what we have seen in the past. That claim, I maintain, is an opinion. We are all entitled to our opinions. We're not all entitled to our facts, okay? So this is a hard question, okay? Now, there are some, at least in the United States, and I apologize that I do not know if this applies to China. I do know it applies to Europe. There are some very serious limitations in the data that we have access to, data about jobs, that do makes it difficult to think in this way. Okay, let's go back. Remember when I said, I now want you to think of an economy as tasks that are being performed to solve certain problems. Tasks are performed by skills. These skills are usually brought together in occupations, and then some of these occupations are done by humans, and some of the occupations might be done by a robot. But I want you to now think of an economy like this. So the question is, okay, I hope this makes sense theoretically. So, if I convince you, if I persuade you that an economy, like today, the United States, is, in effect, a lot of tasks being performed to solve problems. Let's say you believe that. What is your next question? What is the obvious, what's the first question to ask? If I persuade you that there's something out there that exists, okay? So I'm not going to tell you, look, out there in the world, there are lots and lots of horses with wings. You don't believe me. But let's say I persuade you there are lots of horses in the world. Okay, what's your next obvious question? What's the starting question for almost any phenomena we want to study? How many? Can I count them? Counting, correct? Being able to count things is the beginning of any scientific investigation. Okay? That's the difference between science and not science. I mean, when was the last time, if you have someone, oh, here we have a young couple. I'm going to use an example. So you probably tell each other often, I love you, correct? I love you, you love me. When was the last time you asked her, how much? No, you don't ask her? So you say, oh, you love me? From 0 to 1, how much? Well, but ask her. And 0.7, 0.8, 0.3, I mean, we don't ask each other that, correct? Maybe it's a good thing. But for most other things, if we want to have a scientific understanding, tell me how much. So, if I persuade you now, okay? If I have just persuaded you that the economy, a modern economy, China, the US, consists of tasks, what's the question to ask then? How many tasks are there in the United States? How many tasks need to be performed? By the way, this is also an important question when we compare the past and the future. Everybody here probably believes it, correct? If I were to ask you this moment, raise your hand if you believe that we now, at this moment, that China, at this moment, has more technologies than in the middle of the Ming Dynasty. You believe that, correct? Okay. Have you counted technologies in the Ming Dynasty? Have you counted technologies today? So how can you say? So let me give you an example, correct? You probably all believe that we have more technologies today than at the height of the Roman Empire. You know, the Romans, gladiators, okay? I mean, I believe that. But if you ask me, how many technologies did the Romans have? Just give me a number. 10, 15, 20? How many technologies do we have today? Oh, 1 million? Oh, okay. 1 million, 10, we win. That's very hard to do. I happen to have a colleague of mine, young colleague, who's an expert. He's probably the world's foremost expert on this. This is a very specialized question. The ancient Romans, most cultures have things they really like and dislike. There was one thing the ancient Romans really, really seemed to hate. And that's hair coming out of the nose. They hated it. He has counted that the Romans had 27 technologies to get rid of her nose. I mean, if you had asked me, how many technologies does it take to remove, I don't know, 2 or fingers? 27? Like, what? So the answer is, your answer will be, we have more technologies than the Romans, except when it comes to technologies to remove nose hair. Okay? So counting technologies, counting tasks, so we can quantify them, so we can do science, it's very hard because at the moment, we really don't have that data. None of the agencies in the United States. So now, I apologize that this discussion is very US-centric because that was our mandate. None none of the agencies in the United States are tasked with collecting we have data on jobs. How many people are employed? Or how many people are unemployed? Because we can count them. And in the United States, the way we do it is I go to you, do you have a job? Yes, no. Do you have a job? Yes, no. Okay, that's easy. But data on skills, we say, is too sparse. At the moment, we cannot really quantify skills. Therefore, it's very hard to say, well, if I cannot tell you how many skills we have, it means that I cannot measure the rate at which, yes?
I think there's a missing link here. When you count something, better define it.
I was coming to this, yes. Fantastic, yes. Absolutely. Counting assumes I can first agree on what am I counting. So, not only do we have this situation that, well, no one is tasked, and at least in the United States, this might be obvious, this might be the case in China, but in the United States, when we think about the social science research we do, the economics work we do, the questions we can explore, the work we can actually do as scientists is constrained by what data do we have access to. And most of the data that we use when we think about societies, only until recently, I guess now I can get data from Facebook or Wechat, but historically, if the federal government did not measure it, I didn't have data for. So we have data on jobs, but we have very little data on skills. Maybe one of the reasons we have very little data on skills is because defining them is also very difficult. It's easy to talk about skills. You all agree, I have a skill, you have a skill. But what are they? How can we measure them? How can we count them? How can we say, at this moment, I do not know how, well, I shouldn't use names, but big consulting companies. Like a big consulting company whose name starts with an M. That's all. That's all I will say. It's very big, very well known, and an M. Oh, and its favorite color is green. All its studies are green. Okay, that's it. I will say no more. When they say jobs are disappearing at an alarming rate, I literally don't know what the sentence means. I don't. You might as well be telling me at this moment there are Martians are coming to Earth at an alarming rate. It's just that we don't see them. Okay. So I think this is a big limitation that we are arguing we might not have the data that we need to measure what's appearing, what's disappearing, so we can actually answer or make predictions about the effect of AI. Then, it turns out that actually, and this is kind of surprising, this is almost disappointing perhaps, that for such an important question, we have so little understanding. It begs the question, what have we been doing as scientists? We have actually not a lot of understanding of how new jobs are created. I mean, we know they are created, but just how, what is the process by which you have a labor market and new jobs appear and new jobs disappear? We have a lot of historical cases, like the ones I mentioned to you before. People have studied the history of what happened, that the places where horses could eat were replaced with gasoline stations. I mean, we have a history. But that's very different from having a model, a quantitative formal model of how is it that when you have a collection of jobs, how is it that new ones come up? Okay? We have very limited modeling of labor market dynamics. And therefore, very little understanding of how occupations are formed. This is kind of remarkable, okay? I mean, you think this is a very important question, but they're actually, only now, will I argue, in the United States, are we starting to study this. And doing so, by the way, using ideas, I'll show you in a moment, ideas and methods from complexity science. Okay? So we don't have a lot of we call this fine-grained data, detailed data. We don't have a lot of models for how new jobs are formed. We don't have a lot of models for what makes certain labor markets more resistant to change than others. Given this, there's not much we can say at the moment about the effects of AI on jobs. We think that each one of these three problems can be overcome. We're working on this. And there are some efforts in the United States. The main government agency that collects and reports data on jobs is the Department of Labor. And there are some efforts at the Department of Labor to begin to sort of collect this type of data, but it will not be easy, okay? And therefore, I want to illustrate to you some of these difficulties in going from talking about skills, which is very persuasive, to defining and measuring, okay? And so, let's think of, these are three, this is truck driver. This is actually a very important operation in the United States. This is a very large, I don't know in China, but in the United States there are a lot of truck drivers. Again, plumber, my favorite example because I'm in awe of plumbers because I have no idea how to do this. And then software developer, what most of my graduate students want to be, okay? And so you can think about, well, this is an occupation. I apologize, by the way. This is terrible. I apologize that these are all men with beards or mustaches. This is really bad. This should be men and women. So I apologize for that, okay? And I do not know why they all have beards. I don't know. Yes. Anyway, we can think of think of the skills that define a truck driver. And then think of the skills that make a plumber. And then think of the skills that make a software developer. And when you're done doing that, do you want to make sure, do you want these skills to have nothing to do with the set of skills? Or is there going to be the case that there are some skills that are shared by these three occupations? How do you want to define the skills of this occupation? And how are you going to deal with overlaps? Okay? And some people will argue, well, a plumber and a software developer both have the same skill. They're good at installing things. They install things. She installs a program, he installs something. I don't know the name, okay? You agree, correct? But you wonder, okay, but surely, although they are both installing, they're not installing the same thing. So then how do you capture that? This person installs metal pieces, and this person installs programs or applications. How do you capture that? And how do you capture that in a way that you don't end up with such an overwhelming list? Okay? At this moment, I don't think we know how to solve this problem. I mean, here's the problem. Take an occupation. Maybe AI will solve this problem. Here's an occupation. Plumber, you have an occupation. Come up with a list of skills that define your occupation, but that don't end up with this problem that, oh, you have the same skills as a truck driver, but you're not a truck driver. So, okay, so we don't know how to solve this. And here I just give you an example that to say, well, you know about computer programming. Well, actually, this has been done. When people in the United States have looked at the employment of computer programmers by the language they happen to be an expert on, you get very different dynamics, okay? So in the United States, at the moment, if you know Python, good for you. You can get a job. If you know Java, which was very sexy when I was in graduate school, you're not going to get a job. So it's not enough to say, I know how to do computer programming. I know how to do computer programming in a specific language. So there's a sense in which this level of detail is very overwhelming, and we don't know how to capture it in data, unfortunately. And now take this notion of skill complementarity. It's kind of obvious, but it's an idea from ecology that only in the last decade has been brought to think about employment dynamics in the United States, which is that is the obvious observation that none of us works in isolation, correct? It's kind of obvious. We all work in teams. You all work in buildings or offices. Actually, there are some of us here who are very rare because we are a profession where we don't work a lot in teams, and thus us professors, actually. We're really, there are a lot of professors who just are very antisocial and just work by themselves, but most other people need to collaborate. So when you think about my skills, whatever they are, how useful they make me or not, how protected are my skills from AI doing them, depends upon what other skills I interact with. And there's this notion that there are some occupations that are very tightly connected and some occupations that are not. Only recently are we using ideas from ecology and network dynamics to understand that occupations that are very tightly connected to other occupations might actually be harder to remove or to replace, whereas occupations that are not might be easier to replace. But this is work that we're only starting to do. So in this paper, the National Science Foundation, we're calling on the research community to study the ecology of occupations and the ecology of tasks to understand better what could be the effects on AI. If AI replaces this occupation, I take it out. This is a very standard question. For those of you who do network analysis, we do this all the time. You have a network, and we like to ask, what happens to the performance of the network, or the robustness of the network, or the resilience of the network if I start removing nodes? So similarly, we can think of jobs, occupations as being part of a network. But again, we still do not know much about this, okay? Now, here's another notion that we're arguing might be useful for us to think through the effects of AI in a more disciplined manner. And this touches on a relatively recent perspective on the economy. So I have already asked you to think of an economy as a collection of tasks that are performed to solve certain problems. I'm going to ask you to expand that a little bit now and to think about an economy as a product space. This is a perspective that has been developed maybe over the past 12, 15 years, okay? So you can also think of an economy in terms of what the economy produces. At any one time, the economy of the United States can produce certain things. The economy of China can produce certain things. Argentina produces certain things. And there are things that the United States produces that Argentina cannot produce. And some of those things might be a matter of temperature. Okay? The United States does not produce a lot of bananas because most of its climate is not tropical. But the United States produces a lot of airplanes and Argentina doesn't. So there's this notion of a product space. And this perspective argues that the process of economic development, as an economy develops, what it means is to move through this product space. As an economy can do things that it couldn't do before. And everybody's most dramatic example of this, of course, is your own country, China. I mean, it's remarkable to think. What could the economy of China produce in 1960? I mean, make a list. And what can the economy produce today? So this perspective argues China moved in this product space. But notice that in this product space is really a network. Because to produce certain things, you need other prior things, because hardly anything is produced in isolation. So, if you take this perspective, you can then ask the question of how are new products created? And under this perspective, new products are produced through a combinatorial process. You take existing products, you combine them, see if you get something that works. Most of the time, it will not. But we know that throughout the history of humans, most new technologies have actually not that useful. Only a few survive. Okay? So, if you take this view, that this is what an economy is, another perspective of an economy, it's a network of products that are related to each other. And economic development means that new products are created through combining existing products. Then we are proposing a different question and an additional question to ask about the possible effects of AI in society, which is, how will AI affect the process by which products are combined to find new ones? At this moment, that's a very costly process. It's a very time-consuming process. As I already mentioned, you know, if you start combining things, most things don't work, correct? Sometimes we can deduce that. You probably will all agree that combining a diaper, you know, what's used for babies, combining a diaper with a nuclear power plant, that's not a good product. I mean, it would be an atomic diaper. Well, it might work. It might use radiation to clean the baby, but okay, I'm not a baby expert, so. But think of all the products that we could combine, that we just don't have the time or the money to just see if it tries. So, one question we're asking, will AI facilitate the combination of new products to see whether they are a good new product? And if that's the case, this will not affect employment. This might end up creating employment if that new product is useful and its production still has a role for humans. Okay? And now this, if you take this perspective, this provides a connection with cities, which is the last topic I want to raise before we open up for discussion. Because increasingly, when we think about the economy of a nation, of a place, of a region, we are increasingly talking about the economies of urban areas. In the United States, by the way, already almost 85% of the population lives in cities, and over 90% of all output in the United States comes from cities. So if you want to understand the economy of the United States, you in effect have to understand the economy of the 387 cities of the United States. And by the way, in China, increasingly over 60% of your population lives in cities. In the next decade, that percentage is going to increase to 80%, which means you're going to have a lot of people moving into cities in China. So we have argued that you can think of a national economy as being a product space. You can think of urban economies as product spaces or occupation networks as well. Okay? You can think of an urban economy as consisting of occupations that are linked to each other if they need to be performed to produce a certain task. So this here, by the way, happens to be a portrait of the economy of Phoenix, the economy where we live. Phoenix has certain occupations, characterized by circles, and some of these occupations do interact closely. Some do not, so they're not connected. So you can think of, again, an urban economy as a network of other, you can think of these as products or occupations that need to interact to achieve something. And similarly, you can then ask, for the economy of Phoenix to change means that this occupational network will change, that some of these nodes might disappear, new ones appear. That will be a change in the urban economy. And we also have reason to believe that in the past, what has happened is that some of these occupations interact, combine, and create new ones. So we are asking, how will AI affect this process? Again, it's a different question. It's different question from will AI lead to more or less employment? We're asking, how will AI affect the process by which an economy combines things in product space or occupation space to create new things? Will it make it faster? Will it make it cheaper? Will it make it less risky? Will it allow us to experiment more frequently? All of which I think will be beneficial. All of which do not necessarily lead to a net increase in unemployment, because even if some of these occupations disappear, we have new combinations. So in this study in this paper, this document from the National Science Foundation, we are calling on the research community to study urban occupation networks and their properties to try to understand the effects of AI. And there's something that makes this an exciting research question. It's not just an important one, but it's an exciting research question. When you realize that these urban occupation networks that I mentioned, okay? These are different occupations. This network, this is a network. There are many ways to describe that network, geometrically. But urban occupation networks, we argue, are a type of network. It's a very interesting type of network. It's an information network, meaning that the connections among occupations or technologies, when you say occupations are connected, that for me to do what I do, I need to interact with what you do. That interaction involves the flow of matter, of energy, but also the flow of information. And information networks are very interesting types of networks. Because information, and now I'm going to use language from economics, if you forgive me, but I'll try to explain it. From an economic standpoint, information is very, very, very different from any other economic input. What's the main difference? What makes information unlike any other economic input? Yes, meaning, or to put it in the other words, if I'm going to use 100 pounds of coal, this is my coal. If I use it, Deborah can't, correct? I mean, it's my coal. I'm going to use it, I'm going to burn it. By definition, almost any economic input, if I have it and I use it, you can't. Obvious. If I hire you for the next 10 hours to be here doing this, you cannot be hired for 10 hours to be here doing this. Obvious. But information has this feature. I and you and he can use the same bundle of information. This is why we all can learn the calculus. None of us owns the calculus. Isn't that tremendous? One of the most important tools that has ever come out of the human mind is the calculus. Think of all the things for which we need the calculus, okay? And no one owns the calculus. Isn't it fantastic? Yes, Jose, very fantastic. Okay, I mean, it's just amazing, correct? I mean, you don't stop to think about it. But this is what makes learning possible. You learn it, I learn it. So information, to use the physics of language, is not conserved. Sorry, the language of physics, I could have back is not conserved. There's this, so information networks are different from networks that distribute electricity or distribute food. They distribute something that behaves very differently. And that has the possibility, correct, that I use information, she uses information, we combine that information, and we can create something new. So, and we, any one of you who are in the computer industry, and a lot of you are familiar with this very important effect of network effect, correct? Has been studied under different names, Metcalfe's law, Reed's law, Beckstrom's law. It's a very simple phenomena, okay? What makes Wechat useful? Why are all of you in Wechat except us? I don't know how to get in Wechat, okay? What makes Wechat useful? That you're all on Wechat, okay? If Wechat was only used by one tiny village in southern China, no one would know about it. So information networks are useful as they get larger. There's hardly any cost in they getting larger. It's the only network for which we know that the cost of getting larger is negligible. That's just very different type of network. So, if urban occupation networks, this thing, these are occupations, and for occupations to come together to do something requires the flow of information and the coordination of information. So, if urban occupation networks characterize an urban economy, and if new occupations come from existing occupations being combined, see if it works. And if these occupation networks are information networks, then we have an entirely new question, which is, what is the effect of AI on information networks? And the answer is, we don't know. Great. It means that we have something for our PhD students to do. Okay? But this is, this is quite exciting, but it also means that we have to do a lot of work, okay? And by the way, we have some reason as we also know about information networks. Not only are information networks more useful when they get larger, their utility increases when they get denser. And in fact, we have done some recent work that looks at the occupation networks of cities within an urban system in the US, in Canada, in Sweden, Australia, Portugal, Germany. I would love to have China here, but I don't read Chinese. But hopefully we can work with Chinese scholars. And we have asked the question, what happens to the connections among occupations in cities in the US as those cities get larger? And we find that the connectivity of the network increases exponentially. So again, how will AI affect these networks? Urban occupational networks, which are information networks. We are arguing, you really want to say something scientific about the effect of AI on employment and the future of labor, is in effect to ask, how will AI affect urban occupation networks in their nature as information networks? And at this moment, we don't know. I could tell you a story, and people from this consulting company that starts with an M and likes to use the color green, you pay them enough money, they'll tell you a story. But we are scientists. We don't tell stories for money. And we have to be honest that we do not know, okay? Now, I want to end with, and then so we can have a real discussion, I want to end with another question that for many of us is another very interesting question that could have a lot of implications, okay? There's lots of discussion about AI replacing humans. And we already have said that has happened before with technologies, correct? Or technologies augmenting humans. We got here on an airplane. Okay, and so far, we know many examples where things that we human beings can do, correct? I can lift things, I can pick up things, I can assemble things, I can punch things. Think of all the things we human beings can do. I can kick, okay? I can caress. And it's not hard to imagine a robot doing that. Or they already do it, correct? A robot can run, a robot can swim. You can build a robot as a babysitter. So here's a baby, here's a robot, baby, touch the baby. I mean, well, you probably don't go like this to a baby. I don't have kids, so I don't know about them. But what is the one thing that probably most of you think, yes, robots can run, they can swim, they can jump, they can lift, they can punch, they can kick, they can make an espresso. But there's one thing that robots cannot do, you think. What is that? That we think is very human. What do we human beings do that many of us say, hey, that's me, I'm a human. You're a gorilla, you're a cow, you don't do this. What is that? Well, okay, yes, but okay. It's kind of controversial. But some scientists will say, a gorilla can think. But very few scientists will say that a gorilla can invent. Okay, invention. Lots of people say that's what makes me human. We invent. Okay, we come up with new things that have not existed before. And so, one of the questions that has begun to be asked in the United States by researchers, including Deborah and I, is, can AI invent? This is very different from AI can do what a human being can do faster or more accurately. Okay? And this is now a big area of discussion in the United States. Can AI invent? And there are beginning to be some hints that AI can invent. And what do I mean by invent? Okay? It means like you have a problem, a hard problem, and an AI device comes up with a solution that no human being had ever thought of before. Again, it's not saying the AI implemented a solution faster than a human being. Okay, that's good, but this is different from, no, here's a problem, and an AI device invented it. And I think this is, I'm going to maybe take 1 or 2 minutes to talk about this example because it illustrates how very new this question is. And not only that we don't have an answer, we might not even have the right language yet. And so there's this very hard problem in the field of chemistry. It's known as protein folding. You know about proteins? They're this specific type of molecule. We have about 5,000 types of proteins in our body. That sounds like a lot, 5,000. But it turns out that what a protein can do, and proteins are essential, is what allows cells to communicate with each other. When you get sick and something enters your body and the immune system attacks it, it attacks it with proteins. It turns out that out of those 5,000 proteins, you can get literally thousands of proteins, because if you twist a protein differently, the properties of that molecule change, what it can do. It's a fantastic thing, okay? Slight changes. So even though you only have 5,000, you end up, in effect, having hundreds of thousands of molecules of proteins, because all you do is change a little bit the shape. And for decades, it's been a big problem in chemistry and in business for pharmaceutical companies to try to understand, if I give you a molecule with a certain shape, not just a molecule, a list of atoms. If I give you a three-dimensional model of a protein, and I ask you, what can that protein do? Just tell me what it can do. If we could answer that, we would then be able to create new proteins by creating new shapes. And you can imagine many people fantasizing about what we could do and how much money we could make. So that's known as protein folding. And at this moment, we really are not very good at predicting what a protein can do knowing its shape. Every 2 years, scientists from all over the world meet somewhere to compare how much progress we have made in that problem. And they compete with each other. They bring their favorite procedure to predict the properties of a protein based on its shape and to compare. So in 2018, there was a meeting. I think it was held in Seattle. And there were different people, teams. Hey, here's my process. Here's Tencent's process. Here's IBM's process. And you want to beat IBM's process. And then you get a T-shirt saying, I beat IBM. Okay, good. And then there's this team just brought a solution. Say, look, this is I have a solution. I have a predictor for the protein folding problem. Oh, okay, let's see how it. And it won the competition that year. Oh, okay. You probably know where this is going, so, okay. So this device won. Who is the author? Show me the author. I want to shake hands with the authors. And, okay. You know what happened? Okay, oh, you want to meet the author of this really cool process that won and beat Tencent? And then you pull the curtain, and there's a machine. It was a device that Google made, okay? Apparently, for the next 3 years, 3 days, that conference exploded in discussion. Because people, and it made it in the New York Times. It made it like, it's not often that what happens in a scientific meeting makes it into newspapers in the United States, because scientists at this conference didn't agree on how to describe what just happened. Did that device invent a solution to a protein folding problem? And some scientists said yes, like this one, and he was really depressed. And some scientists said, no, that was not invention, because humans built that machine. And so, and to this day, by the way, this was 2018, there still is no agreement. What we all agree is a new solution was brought into the world that didn't exist before, outperforms every other solution. It did not come out of the brain of a human being. Is that invention? You probably also have seen about this example, that in one of Facebook's research labs, where they were doing some work on language recognition, some of the team members realized something quite remarkable. They will give instructions to the device in English, and they found devices talking with each other, not in English. In fact, they were not using a human language. These devices were talking to each other in a language that the human beings in Facebook could not understand. So what's the immediate thing they did? They turned the machines off. They immediately. I mean, imagine it. Imagine if one day you walk into your kitchen and the refrigerator is talking to your rice cooker in a language you don't understand. I mean, what would you do? You're going to get a hammer and stop talking. What if you're talking about cooking me in the rice cooker and then putting me in the refrigerator? Because that would be fun. I mean, that sounds like science fiction, correct? But so we are already getting these glimpses. And we don't know how to talk about it. And Deborah could talk to you about a problem for the US Patent Office and the Chinese Patent Office. US patent law, when people wrote the patent law, you know, patents, we all love patents, Tencent loves patents. It was so obvious that the authors of US patent law did not, you know, they didn't have to specify, by the way, a cat cannot get a patent. There's no need to do that, correct? The US patent law does not specify only a human being can get a patent. Because what for? The Chinese patent law is the same. It doesn't specify. So at this moment, people in both patent offices are thinking, how will we know if we get a patent application and it's not from a human? How will we know? If the application does not say, I am not a human. That sounds like a science fiction question, correct? Like, what? But, so, if AI can invent, I am of the opinion that AI at this moment already can invent in some realms, in some. And I believe it will keep expanding those realms. So the question to me then becomes not, can AI, what's the effect of AI on labor? Will AI displace jobs? Will AI augment jobs? To me, the really important question is, if AI can invent, how will that change technological change? Are we going to co-invent together? Are we going to compete? That to me is, and already we have to start thinking about it. Facebook's reaction was, turn it off. These biochemists cannot agree on what happened. The patent office doesn't have a procedure. So to me, that's the research frontier. We do not know. So for most of these exciting questions, the honest answer is, I don't know. Give me more money so I can keep doing research, hire graduate students, and in 10 years, I will have the answer. But maybe in 10 years from now, society will have already experienced the effects. So that's the, so that is at least where we are in the United States. Lots of questions. We have a sense of what research we need to do. We have a sense of what data we need that we do not already have. And hopefully, we will have enough time to answer these questions before AI turns us off. Just like Facebook's. You know, isn't that, I mean, something about it. That's a very interesting response. I would have said, let these machines talk. See what happens. But it was enough. Turn it off. So hopefully they will not turn us off because we're boring. So what do you think? Do you think AI can invent already? And if so, tell me why. So who here thinks that machines can already invent? That you feel comfortable using that sentence? And if you do, tell me a little bit why. Or if you think, no, I don't think AI can invent, again, tell me why. This is not a test. Did you raise your hand saying yes?
Yeah.
You?
I think it's okay. It just came across my mind that the Google AlphaGo So after quickly learning all the movements of the chess, so they kind of like invent a new move, the chess to beat human. So I'm not sure if that's an invention. I mean, the new. It's okay.
Oh, sorry. Oh, we have more. Oh, sorry. Oh.
So yeah, I'm not sure if it's a kind of invention of like with the new movements of the chess. If you define that it's a new invention, but I think it is.
Well, so this, everybody heard him. So this is another one of the classic examples that makes us think. You can think about it in chess or in AlphaGo, which, by the way, I am embarrassed to admit I only learned when I was here. So
Yeah, so I would love to hear your.
I don't know. This is so, IBM has had this, this American company, IBM, for many years has had this effort to devise a machine, Deep Blue, that can play chess. The idea has been, can it beat good chess players? And a few years ago it did. Now, there are some people who argue when this machine defeated Kasparov, a very good chess player, human player, it defeated him. This machine implemented a game strategy which the strategy was not new, it was seen before. But most human experts, most chess players will have predicted, don't use that strategy, you're going to lose. But the machine, Deep Blue, kind of made a prediction that in using that strategy, the human player will be kind of so surprised and make a mistake, which is what happened. So some people say, hey, that machine invented. Some people say, no, the strategy the machine used already existed. What Deep Blue did, which no human being can do, is to do what the good chess players do. So what does a good chess player do? So I'm playing with you. I say, okay, I'm going to make this move, and I predict you're going to make that move, and I predict I will make this move, and you predict I can make this move. And the very good chess players can maybe imagine into the future 20, 30, 40 steps, correct? Deep Blue can consider millions of strategies and think about millions of steps into the future. It's not doing anything different than we do. It's just that it can do it so much faster that it can just simply say, okay, I'm going to use this strategy, and I'm predicting that you have not seen it in a long time, and you're going to be surprised, and you're going to make a mistake, and I'm going to win. So some people argue that's not inventing, that's just being faster. And I am, in my own opinion, I'm inclined to think, I think that might have been invention. But isn't it interesting that there's no anonymous agreement yet? Who else thinks that AI can invent? But we thought that to us, here's a clear example of invention, meaning of a human brain that solved a problem, creating a solution for which there was hardly any antecedent, and that the solution really was more than just, well, you know the rules, combine things that existed before. So we were asking ourselves, rather fancifully, could AI invent the theory of general relativity by Einstein? Okay, that was a solution to a problem. The motion of bodies, all problem. But Einstein's solution, at the same time that it was very radically new, was completely understandable by most scientists. I mean, but there was a sense in which Einstein didn't just take what we had before and just combine it. there was a sense in which what Einstein did was almost to break the rules a little bit, bring in mathematics that at first seemed to have had nothing to do with the problem. So to us, it seemed like, wow, okay, that's an example of what we mean by human beings can invent. And he and I, as of yesterday, maybe in 10 years we'll change our mind, as of yesterday we thought AI cannot do the equivalent of invent general relativity. We might be wrong. But what we agree is the day AI can do that, we will unequivocally say AI can invent. It can invent. Right? So then, of course, we have to think about, so what is different between what Deep Blue did or AlphaGo does and inventing a theory to solve a problem? Well, we didn't finish doing that yet, but I agree with you that there's something that all of these examples have in common, which is the problem is very clearly posed. The solution set might be very big, but you can't define it. You know what has to be done to find a solution. Just let AI do it, compared to finding a new theory or writing a new novel, although there are examples of AI writing poetry in Japan. So this is where we are now. But I agree with you that that's the frontier. And it will be exciting to be around. I hope.
Yes.
So thank you for your talking today, and I would like to ask a question which is closer to our daily life. So even AI could create many new jobs in the near future, but we found that even nowadays in Beijing, almost every bus has equipped a salesperson on the bus, but their only duty is just supervising the passengers to see whether they have paid the fee to take the bus. If we fire all of those salespersons, there would be a large amount of unemployment. So my question is, could you possibly provide some advice for those who can't reach the most advanced technology nowadays, and to reduce their anxiety? Because not everyone has the chance and the platform to touch the technology, even in this society.
Yes.
Thank you.
That's a very good question, and very good question, and not an easy one, because when, let's say, thinking about the example of the Industrial Revolution, when I mentioned that yes, the data tells us, history tells us that millions of people were displaced from their jobs, but many more millions of jobs were created. But I'm talking about the aggregate. That doesn't mean that every one of those millions of people who were displaced found a job among the millions of new jobs that were created. There is this lack of synchronicity between the people who lose jobs and the new jobs. And I believe that we have to be prepared. And this is, again, what we're talking about in the United States, which may or may not have a policy relevance to China. But in the United States, we are talking about how it might be the case that among people who are displaced from automation cannot find a job among the new jobs that will be created as a result of the new technology. And if that's the case, there will have to be a need for society to provide some sort of support to individuals who cannot make a transition. We, for example, in the United States, have had an example of this, not because of AI, but actually, now, speaking of China, during the 1980s and 90s, there's something that happened in the United States. There's an important phenomenon, which economic historians give it a name. The de-industrialization of the United States, where the manufacturing sector in the United States went from being one of the most important ones in terms of employment to actually being now relatively small. The de-industrialization in the United States was not the result of AI. And it was not the result of technological change. I will argue it was the result of innovation, but not technological change. What is the innovation that I'm talking about? There was a profound innovation. We even know who the inventor was, which resulted in millions of manufacturing jobs being lost in the United States. What was that innovation? Who was that inventor? No, it's much closer to home. Deng Xiaoping, yes. When China opened up, which was not an obvious thing to do, was the beginning of a process that meant that thousands of factory workers in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, lost their jobs. Why did they lose their jobs? What happened to manufacturing in the United States? Did it vanish? Did it move to Mars? Literally, what happened to manufacturing jobs in the United States? They moved to China. It's not that manufacturing disappeared. It moved. And most economists argue the United States did not have an effective solution to those workers. It didn't. Most of the workers that were employed in the manufacturing sector in the United States that earn good jobs, and by the way, I have to be very clear, I am not blaming China. It's a matter of economics. But the fact is that most manufacturing workers were not able to recover their wages in the next job they had. They didn't. It was, by the way, not just an economic problem. Because a lot of those workers who were angry, who do you think they blame? Did they blame the company that moved the jobs to China, or did they blame who? They blamed China. And who do you think those people, when they were angry and had a chance to vote, voted for? So this is an important issue. So it's a kind of a sobering example to me, because when we reflect on what happened in manufacturing in the United States, or another important industry, say logging, in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, in Washington State and Oregon State, logging was a very important industry. But also during the 1990s, there were other sources of wood, cheaper sources of wood that became available, and hundreds of thousands of loggers lost their jobs. They were not retrained. They did not become computer programmers. They either became permanently unemployed or took very low payment jobs in the service sector. So I will argue that at least in the United States, I don't know about China, what happened with manufacturing is a warning that we do not know what to do with with workers who are displaced now. Because they tend not to be the workers that are employed by jobs in the future. And I think we better start thinking about that now and hope to do better. Debbie?
I think there's one thing that you also want to make clear. Despite the change in manufacturing from the United States and its sourcing overseas to China and other countries as well, that the value of manufacturing in the United States, the revenue and income to firms in the United States is higher than it's ever been. The earnings by manufacturing sector in the US are higher than they have ever been. They just require fewer workers to do it.
Yeah.
And that the value created in China has been flowing to those firms. So the gains from this trade have been massive, and the revenues and the income is there to think about tools to help these workers either retrain, relocate, or find some way to make a living.
So I'm not in a position to give advice. I don't give advice, especially not to China. But you need to start thinking now about what would you do with that person in the bus. And if you are all, and one thing we can do now, we cannot make very exact predictions about the effect of AI. But would you not, I think that if you talk to most AI experts, they will say any position, any job whose tasks are very repetitive, that do not involve a lot of them, that are cognitively simple, those jobs will be automated. And those jobs will be displaced. So at the very least, one thing you can all start doing is think about it now. What would you do with those workers? And be aware that retraining sounds a lot easier than it is in practice. And in the United States, we did not think about it when we were manufacturing. We did not make programs in time. And it is an economic and social problem. We don't have, so start thinking about it now. Don't, the day after, and it's hard, it's very hard to retrain people. We've learned that, okay? It's very hard to retrain people. Yeah.
You're talking about the size. When the size increase, the network will produce more value and be more innovative. Do you have any idea about a better like a topology of a network? It's like because like in a company we are always arguing about different type of hierarchy of company organization, and also like some chains about talking about the outsource the work to freelancers, making it a more flexible things. What do you have any idea of what's the best network topology like?
So we have some idea, but I will tell you why the ideas that we have might not be that relevant. So, for any network, and remember, network is a very simple entity. Things that interact with each other, and because they interact with each other, I connect them with a line. So it has been a very long-standing area of research for people who study networks to ask what happens to a network as it gets larger, meaning more nodes, what happens to a network as it gets denser, meaning more connections. But if you want to understand what is the consequence of size increase and density increase, it does become important to consider what is flowing from the nodes. Just what is it? And in the case of information networks, meaning a network where the nodes are connected with a line and what's flowing between the nodes is information, I will argue we don't understand the relationship between the topology of those networks and their performance as much as we do other networks that don't exchange information. We have some hints, I already showed you these network effects, that for a network that is connected to information, increased density is good. Now, for other networks that don't exchange information, increased density after a certain point is actually negative, and it makes the network very fragile. But when it comes to information networks, it might be the case that increase in density is always more positive. At this moment, I don't think we understand those networks as well. But we have some suggestion that size and density matters. If this is the case, and if you think of a company, there are many ways to think about a company, but if you think of a company as an information network, then perhaps outsourcing is not as helpful. And in fact, it's curious that in the United States, I would say over the past few years, there has been a revisiting of the 10 years ago, there were a lot of arguments that outsourcing made a lot of sense and a company should outsource. That argument is being revisited because a lot of companies did do that. So by now we have kind of a record and data. And it seems that, yes, there are benefits from outsourcing, but there were some difficulties. And some of the difficulties might have to do with the fact that when you outsource, you're sort of interrupting the flow of information. So I don't think we have a theory yet that connects that. But some people speculate that the reasons why outsourcing did not turn out to be as beneficial, in some cases, as expected, is because it interrupted information. But I would say we don't have a formal theory yet. But maybe in a few years. So what do you think should be done with the person in the bus who takes the tickets or make sure that Jose doesn't go to the back? When there are displays, let's say tomorrow, every person that works in a bus collecting a ticket is displayed. I don't know how many of them you have, but you will have more than 10. Did you all agree that say, well, the government should give them a paycheck and that's it, and because they are the victims of some movement? Or do you think that no, they should find their own job and go back to school? What would you do? What do you support as a society?
I think you have a critical assumption here. That's all the changes will be happen overnight. And
Exactly, yes.
so if it's not overnight, it will take 10 or 20 years to happen. Then all these old jobs may retire with all these employees. So that's, if all these old jobs retire the whole system, the economy, in an orderly way, and there's new jobs with requirements for the new skills created in an orderly way, then this education system may be efficient enough to generate these new labors and solve this replacement problem. But if really that's happening in like 2 years or 3 years, all these jobs have disappeared, there will be created some very difficult situations.
So you've used a term. I've learned by now, I'm not a China expert, I don't speak Chinese. I've been here a few times. So by now I know that there are two concepts that are very important here. Orderly and harmony. That's very important here. So you're assuming that, yes. Again, in the case of the United States, the manufacturing sector, and think about it, the United States, that's what made the United States what the United States was, a manufacturing society. The end of the manufacturing sector occurred relatively rapidly in social terms, within 20 years, which, now it's true, it's not a week, it's not a year, but most economists will tell you 20 years, that's very rapid. And especially in a context in the United States where the United States societies, okay, this is not a criticism of the United States, but it's not easy for us to think long term. So 20 years felt very rapidly. And in 20 years, that's a generation. And in 20 years, it felt to many people that manufacturing just vanished. And we did not respond. Now, it might be that, of course, it took 20 years, so you had the first year, the second year, jobs are declining, jobs are going to China, oh, what's happening, oh, I still have a job. And then in the 19th year, you realize, whoa, jobs. It's hard to see a profound social change when you're inside of it. But again, we have the past to give us a warning. And maybe in China it will be more orderly, more harmonious. Your government does have policy instruments that maybe the United States did not have. But it's quite striking that you will think that a successful transition will have been, I have a job now, I earn $25 an hour. Okay, you tell me that there's a change in technology. I have a new job. Fine, it's different. Do I earn $25 an hour? Then I'm fine. That's not what happened. And maybe that's the warning that if we don't think about it now, it might happen again. At least in the United States, that's a real concern. Maybe in China, you do have policy methods that, because I'm not an expert, but again, if you ever wonder in China what the heck is happening in the US, remember there are a lot of people that used to earn $25 an hour who are no longer earning $25 an hour. They're angry, they're confused, and they think it's your fault. And they get angry. And I guess not enough of us are explaining, no, it's not the fault of the Chinese. It's because of the Chinese that you can buy very cheap t-shirts and very cheap shoes and very cheap sneakers. But, sorry? And solar panels. It's a complicated discussion about China.